According to the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines' follow-up mission to bring supplies to personnel manning a grounded vessel in Ayungin Shoal has been successful. The routine follow-up rotation and resupply mission to the BRP Sierra Madre was successful through the combined efforts of the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine Coast Guard. On August 22, the Philippines had to conduct a follow-up mission as only one of the two resupply boats was able to deliver items to BRP Sierra Madre after Chinese vessels performed dangerous maneuvers and used water cannons against Philippine vessels. In a press conference, Philippines Defense Secretary was asked about the role of the U.S. Navy Poseidon that was supposedly photographed during the follow-up resupply mission on August 22. Philippines Defense Secretary said the U.S. Navy aircraft seen during the latest resupply mission of the Philippines to BRP Sierra Madre in Ayungin Shoal was conducting freedom of navigation operations on their own. There is no official role of the United States in the resupplies, as they were conducting their own freedom of navigation, which is coordinated with the Philippines military, which they do on a regular basis. China has objected to the resupply missions, saying the Philippines is transporting construction materials to the grounded ship with the intent of permanently occupying the shoal. Beijing is claiming Ayungin Shoal, which it calls Rene Jiao, is part of its claimed territory in the South China Sea. The Philippine government, through the Department of Foreign Affairs, has dismissed China's demand to remove BRP Sierra Madre from the Ayungin Shoal, saying the grounded ship is a permanent military station tasked to protect and secure Philippine rights and interests in the West Philippine Sea. No less than President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has denied that the government had promised China to remove BRP Sierra Madre from Ayungin Shoal. He also said that he would be rescinding any commitment should there really be an existing agreement between the Philippines and China on the removal of the vessel. It pointed out that the missions are part of the Philippine government's legitimate exercise of its administrative functions over the West Philippine Sea, in line with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the 2016 Arbitral Award, and domestic laws. On August 5, the Chinese Coast Guard used water cannons against the Philippine Coast Guard fleet that was on a resupply mission to Filipino troops stationed at the BRP Sierra Madre in the Ayungin Shoal. Earlier in the day, former U.S. Air Force official and ex-defense attaché Ray Powell, a maritime security expert, bared that China had deployed 4 militia ships from Mischief Reef to take up blockade positions as the Philippine ships were on their way to the shoal. Powell said the Philippine mission was escorted by 2 Philippine Coast Guard vessels, BRP Cobra and BRP Sindangan. Notwithstanding attempts by China Coast Guard and Chinese maritime militia vessels to block, harass, and interfere with the supply mission, the Philippine supply ships successfully completed their mission. Several countries, led by the United States, Australia, Japan, and Canada, expressed support for Manila and criticized China's actions, the latest in the string of several reported incidents of harassment against Philippine vessels this year. After the accomplished mission, the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea commended the efforts of the Philippine Coast Guard and armed forces of the Philippines to defend the country's sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction in the West Philippine Sea. Beijing claimed that the Philippine ships intruded into the Ayungin Shoal and violated their laws when it conducted the supply mission. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Ayungin is part of the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. In July 2016, the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, based on a case filed by the Philippines, junked China's 9-line claim covering the entire South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea. China has refused to acknowledge the ruling. The United States backed the Philippines over the incident, saying that it directly threatened the peace and stability in the region. It reaffirmed that an armed attack on Philippine public vessels, aircraft, and armed forces would invoke mutual defense commitments under Article 4 of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty of the Philippines and the United States. South Korea and India have joined the US, Japan, and European countries in supporting the Philippines in its maritime disputes with Beijing in the South China Sea, as China's recent use of a water cannon against a Philippine resupply ship creates a global backlash. U.S. President Joe Biden convened a historic three-way summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol at Camp David last August. While public attention was focused on the leader's response to missile launches by North Korea, and China's aggressive posture toward Taiwan, China's growing hold on the South China Sea was a topic of discussion among the participants. One jointly published document titled, "The Spirit of Camp David," noted the three countries supported a ruling against China's expansive maritime claims in the South China Sea by an international tribunal in The Hague in 2016. The tribunal rejected China's claim that it has historical territorial rights within the so-called Nine-Dash Line in the strategic waterway. With China's unsafe maneuvers near Philippine vessels in mind, the document noted that the nations strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the waters of the Indo-Pacific. The tribunal's ruling sets out the legal basis for the peaceful resolution of maritime conflicts between the parties to that proceeding. Gregory Poling, a senior fellow at the Washington-based Center for the Strategic and International Studies, posted on X, formerly Twitter. The joint statement from today's Camp David meeting includes South Korea's first-ever public support for the SCS arbitration award. South Korea's firmer stance on China reflects a more outward-looking foreign policy that extends beyond the Korean peninsula. Yoon pledged to work with the U.S. and Japan to provide maritime security assistance to Southeast Asian countries during a joint news conference after the summit. Respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, among others, undergird a rules-based international order that resolves to safeguard by intensifying allied countries' collaboration. The first-ever standalone leaders' meeting involving South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. was intended to expand the scope of their cooperation to deal with security challenges presented by China. The united front they presented on the court ruling was one major outcome of their discussions. Biden welcomed their common position, emphasizing, together, they were going to stand up for international law, freedom of navigation, and the peaceful resolution of disputes in the South China Sea. India is another important player that has recently sided with the Philippines on the 2016 ruling on the South China Sea. India and the Philippines issued a joint statement after their foreign ministers' meeting in late June, stressing the need for peaceful settlement of disputes, and for adherence to international law, including the ruling by The Hague. The Biden administration hopes that the increasingly global coalition pushing back on China will give Beijing second thoughts about its aggressive behavior. The U.S. has routinely conducted freedom of navigation operations and imposed sanctions on Chinese companies involved in the militarization of the South China Sea. But this has not changed China's behavior. The U.S. commitment to helping the Philippines secure its interests in the South China Sea is a key to closer security and economic cooperation between the two allies. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. vowed to defend its sovereignty in an annual address to the nation in July. China, for its part, rejects the court decision and continues to block Philippine resupply missions to Ayungin Shoal, also known as Second Thomas Shoal. On the area of foreign policy, the Philippines will not preside over any process that will abandon even 1 square inch of the territory of the Republic of the Philippines to any foreign power. Days after China's use of water cannon against the resupply ship in early August, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke by phone with his Philippine counterpart and denounced China's maritime behavior. Austin reaffirmed that the Mutual Defense Treaty extends to Philippine public vessels, aircraft, and armed forces, to include those of its Coast Guard, in the Pacific, including in the South China Sea, according to a Pentagon readout of their conversation. The CSIS polling pointed out in an interview that the regular harassment of Philippine vessels demonstrates that Chinese ships are clearly operating under the direction of top military and political leaders. Eventually, China will go too far, there will be a mistake and there will be a loss of life. The United States and the Philippines have agreed to restart joint patrols in the West Philippine Sea, as the longtime allies seek to counter China's military rise in the broader South China Sea. The two countries had suspended maritime patrols in the hotly contested area under the previous administration. During a visit to Manila by U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he and his Philippine counterpart Carlito Galvez agreed to restart joint maritime patrols in the South China Sea to help address the growing security challenges in the disputed area. The joint patrol will not limit to the resumption of combined maritime activities. It will also include the conduct of joint sails by the U.S. and Philippine navies in the South China Sea. According to the Philippines Defense Secretary, the combined maritime activity sees no problem with the initiative since defense arrangements in the Philippines are nobody else's business. As long as it will adhere to the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. There should be no problem in holding joint patrols in internationally recognized sea lanes under international law. The Philippines and the U.S. first conducted joint sea patrols in the West Philippine Sea in 2016. Earlier this year, China offered to conduct joint military exercises with the Philippines. However, in the meantime, there is no legal basis to pursue the Chinese offer at the moment. Unlike the United States and the Philippines Joint Patrol, China needs to have a visiting forces agreement with the Philippines to make it constitutional under the Philippine law. Given the Philippines' proximity to Taiwan and its surrounding waters, its cooperation would be critical in the event of a conflict with China. Beijing's growing assertiveness on Taiwan and its building of bases in the disputed South China Sea has given fresh impetus to Washington and Manila to strengthen their partnership. While the U.S. lays no claims to the South China Sea, it has often criticized China's aggressive actions and deployed its warships and fighter jets in patrols and military exercises with regional allies to uphold freedom of navigation and overflight, which it says are in America's national interest. China has told the U.S. to stop meddling in what it calls a purely Asian dispute and has warned of unspecified repercussions. The Chinese Foreign Ministry on Monday accused the U.S. of threatening China by raising the possibility of the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty being activated. Additionally, Beijing has criticized additional agreements by the Philippines and the U.S., which are longtime treaty allies, allowing American forces access to additional Filipino military camps under a 2014 defense agreement. China fears the access will provide Washington with military staging grounds and surveillance outposts in the northern Philippines across the sea from Taiwan, which Beijing claims as its territory, and in Philippine provinces facing the South China Sea, which Beijing claims virtually in its entirety.